When my daughter first suggested that we start talking about assisted living, I didn't hear criticism in her voice, and I didn't feel anger rise up in me. What I heard was concern, careful and restrained, the kind that tries not to hurt even when it has something difficult to say. It came from the same place as when she was a child and would remind me to drive carefully on long trips or tell me not to forget a jacket when the weather turned cold. Back then, those reminders felt almost endearing, a reversal of roles that made me smile. But hearing those words now, as a father who had spent a lifetime being the one who handled things, landed very differently. This time, it wasn't about a building, a plan, or even a specific decision. It was about the realization that the people who once relied on you for everything are now quietly wondering how long you can manage on your own, and whether they should step in before something goes wrong. My name is Michael Harper, and I am 74 years old. For most of my life, I was defined by responsibility, not because I sought attention, but because I believed that doing what needed to be done was its own reward. I owned a small business, paid salaries on time, made decisions under pressure, and learned how to stay calm when problems surfaced unexpectedly. I took pride in solving things myself and rarely asked for help, even when it might have made life easier. I was never the loudest person in the room or the one seeking praise, but I was dependable in a way people remembered. Friends, employees, and family knew that if something needed to be handled properly, I would see it through. That sense of usefulness carried me for decades, quietly shaping who I believed I was. I didn't realize how tightly my identity was wrapped around it until, little by little, it began to loosen. When my wife passed away 7 years ago, friends told me that time would heal the pain, and in some ways they were right. The sharpness fades, and the days eventually stop feeling unbearable. But what no one warned me about was how grief doesn't only take away a person, it quietly removes structure from your life. The shared routines disappear without ceremony. Conversations that once filled the house fade into memory. Decisions that were once discussed over dinner now echo unanswered in your own head. I would catch myself reaching for my phone to tell her something small, only to remember there was no one on the other end anymore. The house didn't feel empty in a dramatic or overwhelming way. It felt paused, as though life had moved slightly ahead without me, and I was standing still, watching from a distance. At first, I managed well enough on my own. I cooked my own meals, drove myself where I needed to go, kept up with bills, and maintained a sense of independence that reassured both me and my family. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But aging rarely arrives with a single defining moment that announces itself clearly. Instead, it shows up in small negotiations you make with yourself throughout the day. I began choosing parking spots closer to store entrances, telling myself it was just more convenient. I rested longer between chores, convincing myself I deserved the break. I postponed tasks that required lifting, climbing, or standing for too long, promising I would get to them later. None of these changes felt alarming on their own, and I certainly didn't think of them as failures. But taken together, they formed a quiet pattern. I was adapting, not failing, yet adaptation can feel like loss when you don't acknowledge it honestly. Eventually, the advice started coming in, sometimes gently and sometimes not. Friends, relatives, and even casual acquaintances had opinions about what I should do next. Move in with family, hire help, find a place where professionals can keep an eye on you. What struck me most wasn't the advice itself, but how confidently it was offered, often without anyone asking how I actually wanted to live. Aging, I learned, makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort pushes them towards simple solutions. Clear answers feel safer than complicated conversations. But life, especially later in life, rarely fits into neat categories or obvious choices. Moving in with my daughter seemed like the most reasonable place to start. She wanted me close, and I wanted to believe that being near family would restore some sense of belonging that had been missing since my wife passed. The first weeks were genuinely pleasant. Meals were shared around the table. The house felt lively again. My grandchildren filled the rooms with noise, movement, and energy that reminded me of earlier years. For a moment, it felt as though I had stepped back into a life that had been waiting quietly for me to return. But daily life has a way of revealing the truth that first impressions hide. During the day, everyone left for work and school, and the house grew quiet again. I spent long hours alone in a space that wasn't truly mine, hesitant to rearrange furniture or establish routines that didn't align with theirs. They were kind and well-intentioned, but kindness has limits when people are already stretched thin by their own responsibilities. Small reminders began to accumulate over time. Suggestions about what I should eat, how loud the television should be, or when things needed to be done. Each comment made sense on its own, and none were meant to hurt. Yet together they created a subtle message that was hard to ignore. This space is shared, and you must adapt to it. I began to feel like a guest in a life that was already full, someone passing through rather than truly belonging. I wasn't unhappy in any obvious way, but I wasn't grounded either. Loneliness, I learned, doesn't always mean being alone. Sometimes it means being surrounded by people while feeling unnecessary, as though your presence requires constant adjustment. After several months, I chose to move back home. Not out of anger or pride, but out of a quiet need to reclaim something familiar and steady, something that still felt like mine. Hiring professional help felt like a reasonable compromise between independence and safety, a middle ground that seemed sensible on paper. I told myself it would only be a few hours a day, just enough assistance with tasks that had quietly become exhausting over time. At first it did work. The help was efficient, polite, and reliable. The house stayed cleaner, meals were prepared more easily, and errands no longer felt overwhelming. For a short while I felt relief, as though I had found a way to stay in my home without pushing myself too far. But as weeks passed, I began to notice how much of my daily life was starting to revolve around someone else's schedule rather than my own. I delayed activities so they would fit neatly into those few hours of help. I adjusted habits that had been mine for decades. I found myself explaining preferences again and again, small details about how I like things done, details that once felt natural and automatic. Even in my own home, a place that had always represented control and familiarity, I felt like I was negotiating for it. The help made things easier, but it also made me feel smaller in ways I hadn't expected. Then there was the financial reality, which I couldn't ignore for long. Each month I watched money leave my account at a rate that felt unsustainable, the numbers shrinking faster than I was comfortable admitting. What I was paying for wasn't companionship or meaning. It was labor. Necessary perhaps and certainly useful, but emotionally hollow. When the caregiver left unexpectedly and replacements came and went, I realized how fragile the arrangement truly was. Each change meant starting over, explaining routines again, adjusting to a new presence in my home. The process itself became exhausting. I wasn't ready to surrender my independence, yet I was living as if I already had, paying a high price for a life that didn't feel like my own. Assisted living was eventually presented as the final and most practical answer. Safe, structured, efficient. The words were always the same. The facility itself was clean, well-organized, and calm. The staff was attentive, professional, and clearly trained to handle situations I feared might one day arise. On paper, it made sense. Meals were provided at regular times, medication was monitored carefully, and emergencies were covered without question. From the outside, it looked like a solution designed to remove uncertainty from my life. But after the initial adjustment period, something inside me began to resist. My days were no longer mine in the way they once had been. Wake times, meal times, and bedtimes were dictated by policy rather than preference. Outdoor access was limited and scheduled. Simple choices were filtered through layers of safety concerns and approval. I wasn't ill, and I wasn't confused, yet I was treated as if fragility defined me. The structure that was meant to protect me slowly became something that confined me. The hardest part wasn't the rules themselves, even though they were restrictive. It was the quiet loss of decision-making that wore me down. After a lifetime of autonomy, being told when to eat, when to sleep, and where I could go felt suffocating in a way I hadn't anticipated. Safety became the justification for everything, the explanation that ended every conversation. Over time, I felt myself shrinking, not physically, but internally. My confidence faded. My voice grew quieter. After several weeks, I made the decision to leave. not because it was unbearable or cruel, but because it wasn't living in a way that felt honest to who I was. Returning home brought a sense of relief I hadn't expected, but it also came with uncertainty. I had tried all the recommended paths, every option people insisted would work, and none of them fit me. For days, I sat quietly in my familiar space, watching the world move around me through windows I had looked out of for years. Cars passed, neighbors came and went, life continued at its own pace. I began to wonder if the problem wasn't my circumstances at all, but the way aging itself is framed. Society seems to believe that growing older means choosing between complete independence and complete dependence, as though there is no room in between for nuance or flexibility. The shift came unexpectedly, without planning or intention. A family in my neighborhood was struggling to balance work, childcare, and the constant pressure of daily responsibilities. One afternoon, without thinking too much about it, I offered to help by walking their child home from school. It was a simple gesture, almost automatic, the kind of thing that once would have felt ordinary. The next day I did it again. Soon it became routine, a small but steady part of my day that gave it shape and purpose. In return, they helped me with groceries, small repairs around the house, and errands I found increasingly difficult. Meals were shared occasionally, not as obligations, but as moments of connection. Conversations happened naturally, without schedules or expectations. There were no contracts, no money exchanged, and no formal arrangements outlining responsibilities. Just mutual support, offered freely and received with gratitude. And slowly, something changed inside me. I wasn't being managed or supervised. I wasn't someone to be watched over. I was participating in life again, contributing in ways that mattered. I was useful, not because I was paying for help or receiving care, but because I was part of a small community that needed me as much as I needed it. The sense of purpose I thought I had lost returned in a quieter, more grounded form, one that didn't rely on titles or productivity. I realized then that what I had been missing all along wasn't care. It was connection. I didn't need someone to take over my life or manage every detail. I needed a reason to stay engaged in it, a reason to wake up feeling involved rather than protected. Purpose doesn't disappear with age. It transforms often into something simpler and more meaningful. The mistake we make is assuming it has to look the same as it did before. Today I live simply, and for the first time in a long while, that simplicity feels intentional rather than forced. My expenses are low, not because I am depriving myself or cutting corners, but because my life is no longer built around paid services and constant solutions. Instead, it is built around relationships, shared effort, and quiet exchanges of care. I have learned that independence does not mean isolation, just as dependence does not have to mean surrendering who you are. There is a difference between needing help and losing yourself. Community fills the space that money cannot reach. You can pay for assistance, schedule it, and budget for it, but you cannot purchase belonging, trust, or the comfort of knowing that you matter to someone else simply because you are there. Aging has taught me patience, humility, and perspective in ways I never expected. I move slower now, lift less than I used to, and rest more often without guilt. There are limits I can no longer ignore, and I have learned to respect them instead of fighting them. But I have also learned that slowing down reveals things you miss when you rush. I still have something valuable to offer, even if it looks different than it once did. I have time to give without watching the clock. I have experience shaped by mistakes as much as success. I have attention, the ability to listen without interrupting or hurrying someone along. In a world that is always moving too fast, those qualities are rare, and they matter more than we often realize. If you are facing questions about how to live as you grow older, I would urge you not to rush into the standard answers simply because they are familiar or socially accepted. Take time to look around you and truly observe your own life. Ask yourself where you still feel useful, where you feel seen, and where you feel at ease. Ask where you still belong, not just physically, but emotionally. Ask how you can remain part of something larger than yourself without exhausting what strength you have left. Aging does not mean stepping aside or fading into the background. It means stepping differently, with more awareness and intention than before. As long as you are here, your story is still unfolding, even if it no longer follows the path you once imagined. It may not be driven by ambition or achievement anymore, but it can still be rich with meaning, connection, and quiet satisfaction. Some chapters are loud and full of motion, while others are gentle and reflective. And sometimes the richest chapters are the quiet ones we never expected to write, the ones that teach us not how to become more, but how to finally be at peace with who we already are.